could be us.
For tuning into Houston Recovery Radio. Houston Recovery Radio is a platform that tries to speak and bring people into the solution of recovery. We would like to take a moment to say thank you to our sponsor, Transformation Enzymes, who has been kind enough to let us use this space we are in to host Houston Recovery Radio. Transformation Enzymes is an integrative, can't talk today, holistic health and wellness company that specializes in transformation enzymes. Let me see. And then I can't keep up with my lines. Enzyme therapy. Detoxing from drugs and alcohol is physically and emotionally taxing on our body. Transformation Enzymes has clinically proven lines of probiotics and digestive enzymes that help the healing process the body needs from all damage caused by addiction and alcoholism. For more information, visit their website at transformationenzymes.com.
Our guest tonight is going to be Kassie Sullins from Heroin to Heroin. She has an amazing story of recovery, strength, and hope, and I'm honored to have her on tonight. My name's Omar, and I met Kassie when she was doing a speaker meeting at the Right Step on a Zoom meeting, and I asked her to join this, and she was more than willing. And I'm going to turn it over to her, Kassie. We're about to put her in. She has a fantastic and amazing story of hope and recovery, and it's just wonderful.
Thank you. Hey guys, I guess I'll start at the beginning. My name is Kassie. I am in recovery. I have a sobriety date of December 31st of 2017. Just going to put me almost at 2.5 years, which is absolutely amazing. It's definitely never something that I thought I would be able to achieve. I think to really accurately, let you guys know why I dove so deeply and so quickly into drugs and alcohol, I have to start way, way, way at the beginning, before I was even born. My biological mother was 15 when she gave birth to me. She got pregnant while she was 14. She decided during her pregnancy that she was going to set up an adoption agreement. She, for one reason or another, maybe it was the fact that she was really young. She didn't have a lot of support at home. I know her mom was gone and dad was also gone pretty much. So she did. She found a really nice couple. She did all of the meetings that they were supposed to do. All of the paperwork was signed. Everything was set for when she gave birth to me. Things kind of went sideways when she actually did give birth to me. She decided that she was going to renege on the adoption agreement. She was going to take me home instead. She had me not very long, and I can't presume to understand why she made the choices she did next. But she took me home. She put me in a car seat and she just left. And, about 3 days later, one of the neighbors figured out that a baby had been crying consistently without any sign of an adult and without stopping. So he actually called the police, and the police came in and kicked the door down and found me. I was about 1 pound and 4 ounces by the time they got me to the hospital. I had diaper rash up to my neck. So my biological mother ended up losing custody of me, and I went into foster care for about a month so that I could heal. And during that time, the adoption agency that she was going to use actually reached out to DFS and kind of just the system and told them, hey, there's this wonderful family that she had chosen before all of this happened. I think we can actually place this little girl with this family. And that's how I ended up blessed with my wonderful, amazing parents that I have today. They were very honest about the rough start that I had in life. By the time I was 4, I knew I was adopted. I knew that my, quote unquote parents weren't my real parents. And by the time I was 11 or 12, I knew the entire story. As time went on, it really affected the way I developed emotionally and mentally. I had a really hard time forming attachments all the way back to, toddlerhood, of not wanting people to touch me, having a really hard time forming those bonds that a child needed to make with anyone, but mostly with their parents as well. And as time went on, I started to develop just this really negative self-talk about myself. I would ask, why is it that the one person that's supposed to care for you most in this world left you to die? Why is that? And instead of, asking what was going on with her and what was, basically wrong with her, I ended up asking myself, well, what's wrong with me? What's deficient about me? Like, why am I not worthy? And that one thought of like, I'm just not worthy carried me all the way into my early teen years. And it developed this really low self-esteem and basically no self-worth or self-respect at all whatsoever. So by the time I was 14 and alcohol came into the picture, I was so ready to just get away from those thoughts, to start numbing and escaping what I knew as reality. From the very moment that alcohol touched my lips, I was already an alcoholic. And I know that sounds crazy, but the very first time I drank, I ended up finishing an entire bottle by myself and blacking out. And I ended up waking up in the front yard of a friend's house the next day, having no memory of, what happened the night before, what I had done, what they had done, absolutely nothing. And a healthy teenager or a healthy person in general probably would have questioned whether or not they should have done that again. It probably should have scared me a little bit that I was waking up and not knowing where I was, and I was literally in the front yard of all places that I could be. But that's not what I was thinking. The very next thought that I had was again, I need to do this again. And so I started to drink more and more and more. And I would at times put alcohol into water bottles and bring it to school. I got to a point where I was drinking every weekend, and then I developed the idea of if it works on the weekends, then surely it's going to work on the weekdays too. And I did. I moved that over to the weekdays. And when I tell you guys that my addiction progressed so incredibly fast, I truly mean that. By the time I was 15, I was snorting bath salts. By the time I was 16, I was shooting cocaine. And by the time I was 17, I was a full-blown heroin addict. Still in high school. I used heroin from 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23 years old. And they were the darkest years of my life. They really were. I think I started like most addicts start, stealing from other people. I would take money out of my dad's wallet when he would leave it on the counter. And I'm an only child, okay? So it kind of explain to you guys the insanity and the delusion of this disease. He would ask me where the money went because I was the only person in the home that could have taken the money, and I would deny it all the way to the ends, even with him presenting me these logical arguments of like, Kassie, you're the only person that could have taken this. Nobody else has been in the house. But that's what we do, we deny, and including ourselves, we deny it to ourselves as well. And I would, throughout those years, I went in and out of these bouts of abstinence, and I call it that because I used to think that those periods of time were recovery, and I would never get any longer than like the first 30, 60, 90 days. I would go to meetings maybe once a week, if that. I would sit there like a wallflower. I wouldn't say anything to anyone. I wouldn't reach out or make any sort of connection. I certainly had no interest in working any steps or getting a sponsor. And the times that I did get a sponsor, it was to appease somebody else. It was to, get my parents off my back, or, to calm my friends down that I was, doing the right thing, when in reality I wasn't doing anything that needed to be done to maintain any sort of recovery. And the truth of the matter is that I wasn't building any of the barriers that I needed between me and that next relapse, or me and that next use. I was still very entitled in the aspect that I thought that recovery would just come to me, that all I needed to do was just sit there, and that it was all going to come to me, and I wasn't going to have to put any work into it. And quite frankly, I wasn't willing to put that work into it in any of those times. When I was 19, I found my second drug of choice, which was crack cocaine. And from that moment forward, I could no longer do one without the other. So instead of having this one monstrous habit, I now have these two monstrous habits that I have to provide for on a daily basis. And, stealing from my parents turned into stealing from anyone and everyone, which turned to stealing from stores and burglarizing homes and, shattering the windows of cars so that I could rummage through the car, to eventually actually stealing the cars themselves so that I could either drive it to go get my drugs, or, take part it away and benefit from selling those parts. But as time went on, I eventually found what caused the most damage to me, which was prostitution. And after I found that, I never really went back to doing any of those other things, because I found this quick, easy way that I could just constantly constantly feed this habit that was growing every single day. And when I was 21, I found out that I was pregnant, and I had been on methadone for a few years at this point, but I was not taking it the way it was meant to be taken. I was using it as more of a buffer so that I could wake up and not feel dope sick, so that I could go and hustle and make money without feeling dope sick. And there were times when I would wake up and take it and go back to sleep, and then wake up a few hours later just as sick as I had, to begin with. And thankfully, when I found out I was pregnant, I had not done heroin in a significant amount of time. And when I say that, probably like 30 days or something like that. I can't remember the actual amount of time, but I do remember that I wasn't doing heroin and I wasn't smoking crack when I found out that I was pregnant. And the doctors, not only at the methadone clinic, but also at the OB that I was seeing for my pregnancy, they told me, they said, Kassie, as your son grows inside you, he is going to start ciphering this methadone from you. He's going to start taking it from you. And you're going to eventually start to feel it. And they told me, they said, we don't want you to feel bad if you have to raise your dose. Don't feel bad if you have to do that. We would much rather you raise your dose than we would for you to relapse. And I would love to say that I followed that medical advice, but I didn't. And I really, too, wish that I could give a valid reason for why I didn't follow that medical advice. But the truth is that I just didn't. There is no rational excuse or reason why I didn't take the medical advice. And exactly what they said is exactly what happened. And I guess I should back up a little bit, because when I found out that I was pregnant, I told myself, that was one of the first times in my life when I actually sat down with myself and had this conversation, and I was like, Kassie, you're never going to do this again, because now you have this beautiful baby boy on the way. You have a reason to live. You have a reason to be clean. And I I decided that I was going to be in recovery and that I was going to be there for my son in ways that my biological mom was never there for me, or wasn't there for me. I was going to be present in his life, and I was going to be clean and healthy and happy, and just listing all of these things to myself that I wanted. But when it came down to it, I still wasn't willing to put the work into it. Yeah. And so when I eventually woke up at the very end of my pregnancy, sick, because my son was ciphering this methadone from me, I had no barrier. Like I was saying before, those barriers that we need to build between us and that next relapse, I didn't have it. And so I woke up, I was sick, I had that one thought that we always have. I want to get high. And there was nothing there to stop me. And so I did. I was 9 months pregnant, shooting dope again and smoking crack with this baby growing inside me. And it kick-started my labor. 4 days later, I believe around that time, I gave birth to my son. His name is Jace. I wanted him to be that, gosh, how do I put it? I wanted him to be what allowed me to stop using. I truly did. I wanted him to be enough. I wanted that love for him to be enough. And again, I set out on this path of, I'm going to be in recovery. I'm never going to use again. I'm never going to stick another needle into my arm again, because now this precious baby boy is right in front of me. He's right here. I see him. I feel him. I love him. I don't want him to suffer. And so again, I went to meetings maybe once or twice a week. I sat in those meetings and I didn't talk. I didn't reach out to anyone. I didn't work any of the steps. Again, I didn't get a sponsor. I didn't do anything. I didn't take any of the suggestions that were being given to me. I still thought that I could pick and choose the things that I needed to do in order to stay clean. I didn't understand that the steps were anything more than just words on a piece of paper. And I didn't understand that they were so vital in recovery for me. And so when my son was 6 months old, I woke up one day and I had that same thought. I want to get high. And I wasn't upset that day. I wasn't stressed. There was nothing wrong. I wasn't upset. I wasn't disappointed. Nothing. I took my son to my parents' house. I told them that I would be back shortly. I told them that I was going to run some errands, and I never came back. And I was gone for 3 months without them knowing where I was. And I want to say without them knowing what I was doing, but they aren't dumb. They knew exactly what I was doing. They knew that there was only one thing on this earth that could get me to disappear and leave a beautiful 6-month-old baby in the care of someone else. And I did. I relapsed. And these last 3 months, these are the last 3 months of my active addiction. And when I tell you that I thought I knew what misery was, I did. I thought that I had been living in misery for years at this point. But compared to the last 3 months of my active addiction, I can tell you that I wasn't even close to living in misery. I switched from heroin to fentanyl because fentanyl was what was on the streets at that point. And I became a heroin addict that refused to buy heroin because it wasn't strong enough. I was 106 pounds. I would eat maybe once every 4 days because I couldn't afford to eat any more than that. And more than just not being able to afford it, I didn't care to eat more than that. That's not where my attention was going. That's not what I was paying attention to. I did not care if I was malnourished, and I didn't understand that energy was just being sucked out of my body because I wasn't eating like I needed to eat. And even on those every fourth day when I would eat, I couldn't afford to spend anything more than a couple dollars on a McDonald's McDouble. And that was it. You know, it looked like every bone in my body stuck out. It looked like I had two black eyes because the circles under my eyes were so dark and so prevalent. I would shower maybe once every 3 or 4 weeks. You know, I wore my hair in a dirty, nasty, ratty bun on top of my head that was just greasy and disgusting. I can honestly tell you guys that I didn't brush my teeth one time while I was out those 3 months. I would walk around with a plastic baggie. I would pick half-smoked cigarette butts up off the ground because I couldn't afford, not that I couldn't afford, but I couldn't afford to buy a pack of cigarettes. I couldn't even afford to buy a 75-cent single cigarette on most days. And I would go to places. I would go to gas stations and 7-Elevens and restaurants, and I would look in their little cigarette containers, and I would pick them out and put them in my plastic bag so that I could smoke them later on that day. And at this point, I had been using needles for so long. There were no veins left for me to use at this point. It took me about 45 minutes every time I needed to hit a vein. And I have such vivid memories of just being so sick, so dope sick, and crying because I couldn't hit a vein, with just tears running down my face and blood running down my arms from the amount of times that I had to fish for these veins. And it got to a point where my entire being was pain, and that's all I knew. I was, spending all of my time prostituting with these people so that I could make the money that I needed to make to get these drugs. And I did it all the way up until, the early hours of the morning, until you physically can't buy your drugs anymore because your dealers are sleeping. And even then, I never seemed to have a problem reaching my crack dealers. So even then, I would just be strung out all night. And then by the time I woke up in the morning, I would be very sick. But I've spent more time sick than I did well because my body had such a high tolerance for opiates at this point. And fentanyl just gets metabolized so fast in your system. I spent most of my hours sick instead of, I can't even say that I got high anymore, because at that point, all I was doing was just staying well, getting off sick, and I couldn't even manage to do that by the end. So at the end of those 3 months, this is December of 2017, the very beginning of December in 2017, I woke up one day with a pain in my chest. And I didn't know what it was or where it came from or why it came. And none of those things were relevant to me. The only thing that I thought was, let me get high so this pain goes away. Let me get high so this pain goes away. And I continued to do that for an entire month. And I kept telling myself, I'll get high and then I'll go get help. I'll get high and then I'll go get help. And that thought process, that delusional thought process, got me through an entire month without me actually ever seeking help. All it did was just feed my next high. It gave me the justification I needed to get high one more time, and one more time, and one more time, until eventually one more time doesn't mean anything because one more time doesn't exist. And so the pain got worse. As time went on in that month, it got to a point where it felt like a knife was whittling off pieces of my lungs every time I inhaled or exhaled. I could no longer walk by myself. I had to lean on someone to walk. I couldn't sit down. I couldn't lay down. I could hardly sleep because every time I moved or breathed, it felt like I was dying. And so this was kind of the first thing that showed me that a higher power is real. But the girl that I was using with, she decided to call my dad. And it was not, I can tell you, it was not out of the kindness of her heart. She could have cared less, about whether or not I got the help that I needed. The reason she called my dad was because she didn't want to babysit me anymore. She didn't want to have me lean on her and walk while we're trying to find men to sleep with for money. I could no longer, hold up my end of the bargain. I wasn't making as much money as I had been making before, and she, by herself, was trying to provide for both of our habits, and that was a nearly impossible feat. That was very difficult for her. And so she called my dad, and my dad, she said, Greg, you need to come pick Kassie up, because if you don't, she's gonna die. And that was the first time that I had heard that voiced out loud. And I realized all at once that she was right, that's what was happening. I was dying. I could feel it. And it almost seemed silly in the moment that I had gone through all of these days without even being able to have that rational thought of, you are dying. What are you doing? Go get help. And so my dad, he came and picked me up and he took me to the hospital. And they did about every test you could possibly imagine. And it took about 6 hours for them to come back into the hospital room. But when they did come back in the hospital room, they told me, they said, Kassie, you have an active staph infection in your blood. And because you walked around for so long with this staph infection in your blood, it's spread to your heart and to your lungs. And you have something called endocarditis. Your heart is fighting this infection. Almost 90% of your lungs are filled with staph. And they proceeded to tell me that I had actually walked into the hospital experiencing sepsis. I was septic and my body was still functioning. And they told me, they said, if you had waited one more day, you would have dropped dead. And really thinking about that at the time, I realized that that's what I wanted. That is absolutely what I wanted. I had tried so many times, tried so many things, inpatient, outpatient. I had tried doctor's offices, maintenance medications, therapists, psychiatrists, everything. I had tried everything, or so I thought I had tried everything. And none of it worked. Every time I tried, I ended up relapsing and losing so many more things that I cared about. I honestly believed that the best thing that I could do for my family and for my son especially was for me to be gone. I thought that the only way my pain was going to end was if I was dead. And I think subconsciously too, that's almost what was going through my mind while I kept pushing it off and off and off and off to go get help. So they admitted me to the ICU and they started me on, a rigorous course of antibiotics. And the first 2 days that I was there, the antibiotics weren't doing anything. My white blood cell count kept raising and was getting worse. The pain was getting worse. The staph was spreading. I had every machine that you could think of was hooked up to my body at this point. I had a breathing machine, a heart monitor. I had more than one IV, in my arm, just all of these things. And this will tell you how sick I was. When I was in the hospital during these days, I had all of these machines on helping me live, and I made them allow me to sign the piece of paper telling me that I understand that smoking is bad and that they tried to warn me not to do it. And they wheeled me down in a wheelchair with a breathing machine on and a heart monitor and let me smoke a cigarette. And I cannot tell you the ugly looks that I was getting from the nurses when I was down there smoking a cigarette. But that's where I was mentally. That's where I was emotionally. I did not care what happened to me. I also didn't understand the full depth of the situation of what was actually happening and how close I really was to dying, because the experience that I had with death was I always came back from it. You know, no matter how many times I overdosed, I was always brought back. So my concept of death and being that close to dying was very skewed, because I just assumed, oh, it'll work itself out. It'll work itself out. Doesn't matter what I do, it'll just work itself out. And so the second 2 days that I was in the hospital, they changed the antibiotic that I was on, because the first one wasn't working. And the antibiotic they had me on then was terrible. It blew every vein they fed it into. And I'm not sure if that was, you know, on the part of the antibiotic, or if that was because my veins just couldn't handle it, that they were just filled with so much scar tissue and were collapsed at different points that they just couldn't handle it. I was getting very sick. I had about a $500 a day habit just on fentanyl. And I weighed too little for them to be able to legally give me as much of an opiate as I needed to stay off sick, for me to be completely off sick and completely well. They couldn't do it. They told me that. And they tried to give me methadone, but it wasn't working. I was getting sick in the middle of the day, and I was getting sick in the middle of the night. And the fourth day that I was there, I waited until everybody left the room, and I took the breathing machine off, took off the heart monitor. I unscrewed the IV port, but I left the IV in my arm. I put my slippers on in the middle of winter in St. Louis, Missouri, with no coat, no actual shoes, and the only item I owned, which was a cell phone. And I left. I did not sign the AMA papers. I simply disappeared when nobody was looking, because I knew they would try to stop me. I knew they would stop me if I tried to leave. And I was walking across the hospital parking lot when I got a call on my cell phone. And I picked it up, and it was a bunch of the nurses from the floor I had been on. I was in the heart hospital. It was a bunch of the nurses in the heart hospital, ICU portion. And they told me, they said, if you don't come back, you will drop dead by the end of 2 weeks. We give you 2 weeks at the very most. If you're lucky, more than likely it'll probably be a day or so, and you'll be gone. And there were so many things that I could have said to them or done in that moment, and I hung the phone up. That's all I did. I didn't say anything. I didn't argue with them. I didn't want to put any energy into it, because I, again, wanted that death. That's what I wanted. And I thought that by taking this option, even though it hurt them to know I was leaving, I thought that overall, this was the best thing that I could do for my family, is give them a life without me. To give my son a chance at living without the just disastrous mess that I was, without the trauma that I had only knew how to create. That's it. That's all I knew. And so I left. I was off and using again. And 2 weeks later, on the dot, I got arrested. And I was taken into St. Charles County. And I was there for about 18 hours. And I was very sick for most of it. And I can't tell you why at this moment I started thinking about these things, but it was almost the precursor to my actual decision to get clean. But I started to acknowledge that I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it anymore. I was so exhausted and so tired of everything that I had been living for, the past years since I had been on heroin and doing all of these things. And by the time I was released, I was so sick. There was only one thing that I could really think about. I couldn't think about the fact that I was dying. I couldn't think about my little boy that I had left behind. I couldn't think about my parents that loved me. I couldn't think about any of it. The only thing that was in my mind when I got released from that jail was that I needed to get off sick because I was that sick. And so that's what I did. My dad came and picked me up from the jail, and I lied to him. I told him that I would go back to the hospital because I knew that if he took me back to the hospital, he had to pass the area that I was getting high in. And so he did. He drove and got me to the area that I needed to be in, and I hopped out of his truck. I eventually got chased around by my dad that entire day, and I still thank him this day for this. He followed me around after I hopped out of that truck the entire day, and eventually I got cornered in a steak and shake bathroom by him and like 4 police cruisers, and that was my actual moment of truth. That was the moment when my back was pressed against a wall and I had nothing else to do but surrender. And that was all I could do. I had nothing left in me to fight. And so I came out of that bathroom stall waving my, proverbial white flag, and I went back to the hospital. And I told my dad, I said, I'll go to the hospital and then I'll go to treatment, because I knew that's what I needed. So they took me to the hospital. They did all the same tests that they had done the first time. Took the same amount of time. And they came back into my hospital room, and I remember the confused expressions on the doctors' faces and the nurses when they came back into that room. They said, Kassie, you have no staph anywhere in your body. It's not in your blood, it's not in your heart, and it's not in your lungs. It's just gone. And it had simply disappeared. They told me that it wasn't scientifically explainable. It was a miracle. And so I went off to treatment. And I stayed as long as I possibly could. I did everything they told me to do. Then when I left treatment, I went to outpatient. And again, I stayed as long as I possibly could. And I did everything that they told me to do. And when that was finished, I spent most of my time at meetings. And I did the one thing that I was never willing to do. I started to work for it. I started, I got a sponsor. I started to go through the steps. And eventually I finished the steps. And then I decided to go through them again from a different fellowship. And I got to a point where I started to live those steps in my everyday life. I started to live the principles behind those steps. The honesty, open-mindedness, willingness, acceptance, understanding, humility, hope, faith, peace, all of those things I began to incorporate into my everyday life. And the one thing that I never had that recovery and recovery programs have given me is the ability to build that self-love. Yes. Get rid of that negative self-talk that I had only known pretty much my entire life. And I stopped telling myself that I wasn't worthy, because I started to believe and develop this inherent belief that I have value just as a human being, as Kassie, I have value, and that I'm capable of doing all of the things that I want and need to do. Because recovery was giving me the opportunity to show myself that I was capable. It wasn't something that I just told myself. I was following those words up with action.
Yes.
And that's what taught me how to be responsible and accountable and productive, and eventually finding the one thing that I never had, which was just overwhelming joy. And with that came happiness. And things that were never possible for me when I was in active addiction, and even before I was in active addiction. The biggest thing is that I found myself. I figured out who Kassie was. Without drugs and alcohol, without the low self-esteem, low self-worth, no self-respect, without all those things, I figured out what Kassie liked and what Kassie didn't like and what my passion was. And I pursued that passion. Eventually I got to a point where I decided that I wanted to didn't decide that I wanted to create a blog, but I did. At the same time, I went through a loss. I lost somebody that I really cared about to a fentanyl overdose, and decided that I never wanted someone else to go through that alone, or to feel like they were going through that alone. And so I created a blog. It's called Heroin to Heroin, and I started sharing that hope that I had been given from other people. And I started spreading the message that, you don't want to die. You just want your pain to end. And here are all these different ways that you can get that pain to end, regardless of what path you take, or what program you work, or where you go to treatment, or regardless of all those things. You can have this just like I had it. And time passed, and I went through the Missouri Credentialing Board, and I ended up getting my peer certification. And I started working for a residential facility as a peer specialist. And now I get to live that passion every day of my life. I get to spread that hope to people that don't have it. I get to tell them that life is worth living, and more specifically, their life is worth living. Not just mine, but theirs. And that they're capable of the recovery that, other people have. They're capable of that. And they, like me, like you guys, like everyone, have that inherent worth and value, just being themselves. Yeah, that's about it. That's where I am now.
Well, that's fantastic, Kassie. I'm going to ask you a couple questions now. So when you surrendered, when did you notice that you'd fully surrendered to win? When you were in the bathroom?
Yes. So that day, I hopped out of my dad's truck, and I went and I prostituted and made the money I needed. I got the drugs I needed, and then I started on a course of finding a needle, because I had been arrested and didn't have any. And that's when my dad found me, and it was almost like the reality of everything just popped into my head. And it wasn't just that it popped into my head, but I understood the full weight of everything that was happening. And it was just years worth of exhaustion, years worth of being just tired, just sick and tired of being sick and tired, just years worth of it. And I knew with my whole being that I couldn't go on. I couldn't do it. I knew that the only thing left for me in that life was dying. And I realized too that actually facing this death, that's not what I actually wanted. I was actually afraid to die, even though I had told myself that was the solution. So,
when was it that you first noticed that you had a spiritual experience and a psychic change and overcame your spiritual malady?
Oh gosh, probably when I reached step 4, which is we made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. I think once I I mean, all of the steps, regardless of what program you're working and what you're doing, whether it's NA, AA, HA, Smart Recovery, Refuge Recovery, Celebrate Recovery, whatever it is, that's what those steps do for you. You know, they strip everything away. They strip the drugs and the alcohol away, and they allow you to see you clearly. And that's what that step 4 did for me. And as I was sitting, you know, and writing all of the things that I had done in my active addiction and all of the things that had been done to me in my active addiction and my character defects, and then eventually getting to my assets and the things that were good about me, things just started changing. And I say this a lot, you know, life doesn't change. Whether you're using, whether you're not, wherever you are, life is going to be life. It's going to be hard. There are going to be curveballs that are going to be thrown at you. Bad shit's going to happen to you. You're going to be upset. You're going to lose things that you care about. You're going to get fired from jobs and broken up with. And all of those things are going to happen. But what those steps and what recovery does for you is it changes you and your ability to process those things, feel those things, and continue to move forward. So yes, I think when I finally realized that the obsession to drink and drug had been lifted from me was in the process of working the steps.
That's fantastic. Also, when did you first notice that the promises were coming true?
Oh gosh, almost, I would have to say around 6 months of sobriety. Because around 6 months of sobriety, I picked up a speaking commitment, and I started going back to the facility I went to when I finally found recovery. And I went on the unit and I started speaking to the people that were on that unit, and I started to fully understand what service work does for you and for other people.
That's fantastic. What I always say this is self-esteem is built through esteemable acts. So when you're out there doing...
I'm so glad you said that. I
Yes.
love that. That's my favorite quote.
Yes, self-esteem is built through esteemable acts, and through service work, we're helping others, but we're also helping ourselves. When did you first realize that the commitment to an AA club or whatever was not only beneficial to you, and you started? When did you start getting sponsees and working with others?
About a year clean is when I started taking on other women that I could start sponsoring. I was very strict about a lot of things. Being a sponsor, I wanted to make sure that I was emotionally capable, mentally capable, mature enough. I was very concerned about, you know, causing more damage to people, so I waited until I had about a year clean. And it didn't take me a year to work through the steps for that first time. So when I was finished working through them that second time, that's when I started sponsoring other women.
That's fantastic. What message of hope would you say would you give to the newcomer who's still in the room suffering?
Oh gosh, that your life is worth it. And I know it's so difficult to see right now, because a lot of the things that we see when we're that new in recovery is just the damage that we've caused, that wreck that we've caused in our life, the havoc, the trauma, the misery, the pain. It's hard to see past those things, but you're worth it inside and out. And not just that you're worth it, but that you're capable and you deserve it.
All right, here's the really hard question. How did you overcome the initial fear when you first got sober? Because fear stands for face everything and recover, or fuck everything and run.
So I think the deepest fear I had was living without drugs and alcohol, because I had been on some sort of drug or alcohol since I was young, 14. And I didn't know who I was. I didn't know where my place in the world was. I didn't even know my relative importance to like my family members and my child, let alone where I was supposed to be in life and in the world. And I think honestly the only way that you can overcome fear, whatever you're fearful of, whether it's going to treatment, living a life without drugs and alcohol, whether, whatever your fear is, all we can do is take it one step at a time. That's it. That's one of the main things that we do to overcome our fears. We don't face our fears and recover one day at a time. It's not an event. It's a process. It's a journey.
That's right.
One day at a time. And sometimes one day at a time is too much for us if we're new in recovery. Sometimes we have to take it 1 minute at a time, 1 second at a time.
Yes. And say, this too shall pass. Cecilia, do you have any questions for her?
I do, actually, because I was listening to your story, so it's a very inspiring story, and your dad loves you like a whole bunch, because that day he chased you around all day long.
He did.
Yes, and so he was relentless on giving you a second chance to live right, because this is what he felt that you needed. And so, God, wow, you're loved so very much. And so I have that saying too. I say this all the time: life does not change, you do.
Yes.
Okay, it just doesn't change, you do. So you learn to look at life from a different perception through a different pair of lenses. And so another thing that I heard you say is that you came into the program of recovery. And so what I've realized throughout a duration of, me too, I had a program of recovery, but it's a lifeline. So a program of recovery is a lifeline. So as you stayed in the rooms, that's how you were in the program of recovery. So then you started to practice what you were taught within those rooms. So therefore you evolved, right? Because you evolved and you ventured out in those rooms and you became a peer specialist. And because a peer specialist details different things, right? Can you explain that to the audience, what your job description is in helping people in recovery?
Absolutely. So we are very peer-based, which means all peers, regardless of where they live or what state they're in or where they're working, are in recovery from something, whether it's drug addiction, alcoholism, or simply just mental health related things. They can also be in recovery from that. So we're on a different level than, counselors or therapists, where we can really get, that peer-to-peer interaction of like, I understand what you're going through because I have been here too. Mm-hmm. And this is what worked for me. This is all of the options you have. You don't have to put yourself into this box. You have all of these different paths. Let's explore those things together. Let's find what works for you while you're still here in treatment and you're in this safe environment. That way, when you leave, you have this foundation already built for you. You don't have to figure this out on your own.
Yes, it's true. And so I'm a clinician, and so you're right. So it's the roles that we play in a client/patient's life, right? So we have to be very specific on the role that we're going to play and interact with the client/patient. And so I have to learn to say it this way because I work in a clinical treatment setting. So they are patients. And so I've been taught for a really long time to say clients. So that's why I say clients/patients. So it is because I would say clients, no, Cecilia, they're patients. This is a clinic, and so they're patients. It's like, okay, so it's something that I had to relearn, right? And so I'm very specific on how the roles that I play when I interact with an individual, right? Because it's very important. So I would always ask my professor when I was in the classroom, okay, how do I know how to proceed in helping a person through their recovery process? Because I was very uncertain, because I didn't want to, self-disclosing is a really big thing. And so self-disclosing is a really big thing. So we have to be very careful on what we share with the patients/clients. And so And I know that peer coaching or peer specialist, you don't have that. You can just share everything.
Exactly.
And so
Absolutely.
that's important as well, Kassie. And so, and that's why you got involved, because you were active in your addiction for such a long period of time, and so you are a peer specialist, and so you help others. And so, does it bring you more joy? Because you said you already have that joy and that happiness. So how does it feel when you work with somebody else?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It does. It really does bring me a lot of joy. I never could have thought or really understood the relationships that I've made with people, being their peer and being able to work with them. And I can't take responsibility for their recovery, because that's absolutely not me. That's between them and their higher power. But I'm so blessed to be able to watch them go from, just sickly looking, malnourished, hardly able to walk and function and talk, to just the light coming back into their eyes, the blush coming back to their faces, and them not losing, but gaining some of that weight, and just the smile that comes on their faces. And we actually we don't call our people patients, we call them members, and we do it on purpose so that they know that they are members of the recovery community. So no matter how long they've been out of treatment with us, they will always be members, because they will always be members of the recovery community.
That's fantastic. I do have one last question for you. What is it like to take someone from being sober to recovery?
Oh gosh,
That's a great question.
It's amazing. I love that. I think a lot of people, it's hard to kind of describe the difference between being just sober to someone to being in recovery. Gosh, it's an amazing feeling to see that switch turn in their minds, and it's almost like the immediate difference from one to the other is they start seeing things differently. They don't view things the same way. They start looking at life differently. They look at themselves differently. They look at their peers differently. And I get to see this a lot, and it's really awesome to see this. But watching people process through emotion while they're in treatment, because a lot of them come in with no emotional regulation at all.
Oh, yeah.
And by the time they leave, they're talking themselves through their anger, and they're able to actually put out their own fires and act in a more responsible way or a more mature way. But really, it's a blessing to be able to see them building new and healthy relationships with others, which is something that comes from recovery. Finding that forgiveness for themselves, which is like a weight lifted off their shoulders. I mean, there's so many things that I could just keep listing, but basically just finding that joy themselves, and eventually you're hopefully getting to the point where that obsession is lifted from them.
That's fantastic. All right, well, that was our guest tonight, Kassie Sullins.
Thank you,
Check out her
Kassie.
blog on Facebook, Heroin to Heroin. It is absolutely fantastic. She has an amazing quote at the end, and I used it for our event. It says, "If you are still breathing, you have hope." That is from Kassie right there. Thank you so much for coming for joining our show tonight.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. Thank you for tuning in. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in to Houston Recovery Radio. We have another guest on next Monday at 8 p.m. We're struggling to find the right equipment for our audio production side of things. If any of y'all want to donate equipment to Houston Recovery Radio, please give us a shout out via Facebook or Twitter, or if we have a GoFundMe page. Anything helps, even if it's like $5. The money we raise will help us give us more back to the community. We also have entry-level sponsorships for people or companies that want to help us as well. Thank you for all the support and well wishes through this process. Without this community, we wouldn't be able to do this. That is for all now, and see you freaks on the next one. Thank you, Kassie.
Bye.